But we've skipped the OGL, haven't we?
We have. You
Let's think
mentioned
about
Ryan
this. Oh,
Nancy.
yeah. Well, Ryan Dancy is my age. He's still around, of course. That's not necessarily true. But in his case, Ryan Dancy is available, and I urge you to speak with him. I don't know. I attribute this quote to him. I know it's a quote.
Mm,
I don't know. It was not attributed to anybody when I received it. But knowing the people, I attribute it to Ryan,
yeah. Okay.
which is in the very early days of strategizing this whole thing. He said, we must understand that this is not a game, this is a culture.
Mm,
This is a generational thing with its own issues, its traumas, and its
hmm
priorities, and its catchphrases. We have to convince them that we're on their side, that we are them. And they are too. I mean, they're Ryan and Peter and all the rest of it. They're a bunch of gamers anyway. So therefore, it's not that's not a stretch. They just have to
hmm
remember that.
Yeah.
They have to remember that this is what they're doing. And Ryan was absolutely right. Now, we should distinguish, right? There's the open game license as a concept that anybody can
Mhm.
do in some way.
Yes. Yes.
Personally, anything that gives it initials like OGL or GNU or anything cracks me up, because the whole point is that you don't need initials to, sanctify it. But for some reason, people have been doing it.
hmm
And then you have the specific publication or source reference document called D20.
Yeah.
So you could be OGL without being D20, or you could be OGL being D20. The difference in practice is minimal.
hmm hmm
Um, Now, you probably know this in more detail than I do. But the interesting thing about the OGL as written by WotC at that time is that it actually says nothing.
It's
Because,
very difficult to understand as
well, here's
well.
my point. That's because, and here's where Ryan does earn his sobriquet of sort of the dark genius of all of this,
Okay.
because he knew the vulnerability of the culture. It's a
Mm,
religious subculture. They want to be included very,
mm,
very badly.
yeah.
They don't want to just do their thing, they want to be included.
Okay.
So, therefore, you may know that you cannot patent or copyright, even. You cannot copyright a game rule,
That's right. Yeah.
not in isolation.
hmm
Nor can you copyright even an entire set of systemic rules. You
Yes.
can, if you had every single rule exactly the same, maybe somebody would have a case, but
hmm
only if
hmm
somebody could mistake your product for theirs.
Right.
If you took
Yes.
effort to make sure that your product was not, actually replicating theirs, then they can't do shit.
hmm
And I'll go a little bit further, that you cannot you can use the very same rules as long as you explain them differently. You don't use their
Yes.
block of text.
Right.
Now, the OGL basically pretends that none of this is the case. The
hmm
OGL pretends that if you whiff D&D off of your product, we whiff D&D off of your product, we're going to sue your ass to the ground.
hmm They're it's yeah,
That's
no,
what it only makes sense if you believe that. And they don't come out and say that, but what they do say presupposes it in such a fashion that your own fears and assumptions are only going to be reinforced.
hmm hmm No, you're
So
absolutely right. Yeah.
so this is
Legally,
extremely important. I at this point was thinking about starting to think about publishing a role-playing game.
okay.
The
Yeah.
basics of two games that I have published since are have actually been coming into place at this time around 1992 through 1994. One of them became Sorcerer within a very few years, and another one waited until the 20 teens when I renamed it and called it Circle of Hands. So I'm
Okay.
already I'm already like scribbling, right? I've realized that I have the personality disorder in its
hmm
severe form,
Yeah.
and that, yeah, you saw that part, right? And
I did,
so,
yeah.
yeah, I have the personality disorder in the severe form, and all the other things I'm doing with my life notwithstanding, I'm just going to have to do this too.
Okay.
So what I learn is, first of all, there's this very thing. And so when the OGL comes out, I'm staring at it slack-jawed saying, why on earth would you ever put OGL or D20 on the back of your game? Why
Just
on
too
earth would you do
dangerous.
that? No, that's not it at all. It's not about dangerous.
No?
Why are you bending over and making yourself a billboard for this other entity?
I see. Okay.
Why on earth are you carrying their water for them? Why on earth are you saying that your role-playing game is an adjunct to theirs? And the answer was, it's legitimizing. It is, they wanted to be part of TSR in that way.
Right.
They wanted to have their adjunct. They did want to be adjunct. They wanted a branch. They get to be their own little, think about it, your own little, you own this particular franchise of Waffle Heart or Motel 6. You manage this particular outlet of it, and you're liable for it, and we're not, but you get to be Motel 6.
Right. So this is relying in a sense on a sense of, I don't want to say authority, but at least like a sense of centrality. Like if an OGL came out,
it even becomes authority because, in particular, the Williams had done a very good job with their lawfare.
Okay.
The Williams are the ones who killed off Gary Gygax's efforts, because you don't have to. I mean, they're the ones who were trying to copyright the word dragon. You couldn't use the word dragon. You know, they did all this spurious bullshit and made all of these spurious announcements of what they would and wouldn't permit. And they would, so for example, Gygax, once ousted from TSR in 1986, he and Menser actually were trying to buy it. The Williams sale nipped it out from under them. And so Gygax went and tried to do 2 games. One of them was called Dangerous Journeys, and the other one was called Legendary Adventures. And do I have Legendary Adventures? I'm not sure, but I have Dangerous Journeys. And the point, though, is that he was doing it through Games Workshop, and he basically they threatened all sorts of lawfare against it. They threatened suit on him. They didn't serve anything on him, but they made it known that they would. And the distributors dropped it. And at that point, if the distributor wasn't carrying you into the stores, then you could not know, there's no way to sell your game. There just isn't. So basically, it was killed off just because the distributor, was scared. And the Blooms were very good. Not the Blooms. The Williams were very, very good at this. The Blooms actually tried hard in their own way too. But this is the early 90s, and this kind of spurious law work is very, very common. And weird contracts that could not possibly, stand the test of a suit. So please keep in mind, none of this ever went to court. The one time it's ever gone to court is when the gaming company won with White Wolf and the movie studio. Right, but gamers were and are convinced that TSR successfully sued a ton of people and drove them, into destitution and ruined their games. You can't possibly do anything that'll piss off TSR. They'll come and get you.
And so is the OGL, in a sense, like a continuation of this?
Absolutely.
Seen as it, at least.
No, it's a continuation of the principle, and it wasn't seen at it. This is where the dark genius comes in. It is seen instead as the most wonderful opportunity ever. Remember that a huge romance among the isolated and weird culture that we're talking about, the huge romance is compatibility. The day when all role-playing games are compatible, the day when you can bring characters from one into the other freely and nobody will ever argue about a rule. It will be wonderful. It will be wonderful. Paradise. And so this is tapping into that romance very hard with the inclusion of being actually, oh my God, TSR knows who we are.
Interesting.
Somebody picks up, and remember, people are utterly ignorant. I know people who think that Gary Gygax ran TSR up all the way through the WotC purchase.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And he had no executive power over anything that went on since
Mm,
1975.
mm, okay.
So the myth making and the very very poor institutional memory is extremely exploitable by anybody who gets their
Mm,
fingers onto any form of marketing.
I see. So Ron, I really want to ask you a little bit more about what you mean when you say this fantasy of compatibility. Like, where the idea that the OGL kind of, at least conceptually, it sounds like it does two things. The first thing is that it makes people feel like they're included, and it plays to this idea that one day we'll all be able to play like, well, all the systems will speak to each other.
Exactly.
And just prior to this, if I'm not mistaken, comes out another system that is, it seems to me, might try and appeal to this sense as well, which is the general universal role playing system.
Oh, well, that's actually quite a ways before that. That goes all the way back to 1986, but it has its roots in Melee and Wizard, that game that I talked about earlier.
Okay,
19,
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Steve Jackson was the primary designer for Metagame.
right.
And
Okay.
then there was a huge court blow up, and he ended up losing the fantasy trip, his fantasy game, but he
Oh,
kept Ogre.
okay.
And so then he made a new fantasy game whose roots are clearly in the older one called GURPS.
And that
Um,
was, yeah.
but he's not even the first. That romance was there with the Chaosium,
Mm,
who, upon putting out RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu, suddenly put out like Super World and all these others really rapidly to try to
mm,
create this thing. The Hero System, which was the first game to really hit it big with superheroes, Champions,
mm.
converted itself into, well, Hero Games was the company.
Okay.
They had a bunch of different games, but then in the late 80s, they pretended that they had a universal system, which they call the Hero System, and so kind of
Mm,
reversed it so that Champions now became an auxiliary to this bigger system, which by the way was terrible. Champions was brilliant. The Hero System.
okay. Well, that comes
And
to my next question, which is just, if you look at this, the trend, the idea, in a lot of ways, the OGL has succeeded in trying to make people think that this is something that they can contribute to and that there's this kind of common system. The G20 system is this like common role-playing game language. Whereas GURPS, it's not really reached the same level.
no, GURPS always remained a node.
So why is
GURPS
that?
for GURPS people, because first of all, the ideal is crap. The second that you play, I mean, okay, for reasons. I introduced a notable comic book creator to role playing in the mid late 80s.
Mm,
And the setting and circumstances concerned the fictional stuff that interested us was a well of worlds with all sorts of magic and science and all sorts of weird stuff caroming off of each other in a very urban setting. Now, this is a trope that precedes this particular comic and has continued since this particular comic, but this particular comic was a very good one.
okay.
So anyway, the point is that we get together, and it seemed very reasonable to us in 1987 that GURPS would be the thing to do because it can do everything. And we quickly
Mm,
realized that GURPS can do anything as long as it's just plain old GURPS.
mm,
It drains every single universal system, so called, just drains the energy out of whatever you play with it.
mm-hmm,
So you
mm-hmm.
only play it if you're a fan of that specific system experience.
Okay, I
And
see.
every single one of those companies does nothing but publish effectively encyclopedia articles on different
Mm,
genres and different settings and different historical circumstances and different
mm-hmm,
literatures
mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. And that's what Steve Jackson Games became, was in fact nothing but a a sort of numerically fetishized repeater of Encyclopedia Britannica articles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right.
So sort of a gamer's reference shelf.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's what people did. And every one of these companies that's done that, that's what they've become.
Yeah.
And so remember my concept of the medium versus its specific instrumentation.
Mm,
System is the specific instrumentation. So the idea that somebody says we will celebrate the medium by giving this one particular specific instrumentation that now everybody's going to use forever and no one will ever argue anymore, Try
Mm.
to apply that to music. Good fucking
We're
luck.
kind of going backwards. We're going back the other way. We're trying to pretend now that the system is actually the medium,
Right,
or right,
right,
we're positioning it that way.
exactly.
Okay. Hmm.
And but do recall, however, that during the late 80s and through the 90s, the mantra was system doesn't matter, because
Mm.
you had the game master who did the reading, and everything that happened, there was no reincorporation. It was all edited by the game master of what could be said and how it could
Mm.
be interpreted
Okay.
so that the story would go on. In
Yeah.
this, White Wolf and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition are precisely the same. I mean,
Hmm.
precisely the same.
Mm.
I mean, they're it's pound for pound exactly the same.
Okay. Right.
So the idea was at this point that we're talking about that system doesn't matter, and the OGL thing was not about how great the system was. It was that it was D&D. It was the system. That's
Hmm.
what mattered.
Hmm. Okay.
That was the important thing. However, you do know where the D20 system comes from, right? It comes from 1993 Talislanta, the
Mm.
third edition of Talislanta, written by not the original author of the game, but written at that time by Jonathan Tweet, working for Wizards of the Coast.
Mm.
So Jonathan Tweet, working for Wizards of the Coast, basically just ports his system. So there is
And
no
that becomes
continuity.
the third edition of
Yeah,
Dungeons and
exactly.
Dragons.
There is no continuity between the WotC
Hmm.
D&D and any other form.
Right. Yeah. Kind of
They
skipping
just
ahead, the same kind of disconnection you can see in on the system level between third edition, fourth edition, and of course fifth edition as well.
well, it's interesting because fourth edition actually makes a bit of a swerve in a couple of different ways. For one thing, I think it's probably the most intelligent version of a Dungeons and Dragons system that's ever been done.
Mm.
Second, they made a lot of infrastructural. This is when Hasbro by itself was trying to run the joint with this whole thing, and they made a hash of it.
Okay.
You do not take a cultural intergenerational thing and release a third edition and go
Mm.
woohoo, and then like within a couple of years introduce another one.
Mm.
You don't do
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
You need a new
And
generation. You don't want the same guys encountering
right. And
that.
we
And
can see a lot of fallout from the
oh
decision
yeah,
that they made with
yeah.
fourth edition, regardless of how
Well,
intelligent the design was.
they also borked another important way. They tried to import all that IP into it where it didn't belong. They made
Mm.
the mistake of actually writing an explicitly good role playing game that would demand specific aesthetic approaches, specific content, and specific experience. But
Hmm.
no, they wanted to create this more, they wanted basically all of that Forgotten Realms stuff and everything else to be piled into it
Okay. Yeah.
as content, and it doesn't work. They also try to incorporate that guided campaign thing that I was talking
Hmm.
about, which for which the system is eminently badly suited.
Mm.
That's why I say it's an intelligent system. You can actually play it.
Yeah.
Well, and
Right.
if you actually play it, then you can't do these program campaigns.
Hmm. Hmm. Right.
So
So
it was
just yeah.
so the game
Uh,
was. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No, no, I'll follow up after you finish your thought. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't want to get hung up on fourth edition. I do want to point out that um, we are seeing basically Hasbro making the best of a bad job. They're making the best of a bad job, and like everything around 2010 ish,
Hmm.
are trying to catch what the internet is telling them.
Hmm.
Television and television adjacent, stuff. Netflix hasn't really become itself yet, but cable and stuff have turned channels, like HBO have turned things differently, made things a little different
Hmm.
by this point. And you'll notice that in those shows, they're trying to interact with the fan base. They're trying to have blogs and forums and mailing lists and stuff, and trying to sort of run ahead of the tidal wave of wherever the fans are going with
Mm.
this show in progress. And it works out poorly and well in various circumstances. Best example I can give you is Battlestar Galactica, when they got this groove going of interacting directly with the fans to seeing what the fans might want.
Mm.
The whole thing falls apart. It blithers.
those last seasons are
Yeah, that's why. But that's
yeah.
why, because they didn't plan on any of those. They did a good job on the things that they came to do, and then they
Mm,
were trying to please the fans from that point forward, and they ended
right.
up just kind of splattering everywhere. Look at any version of Star Trek after that point, at about that point too,
Okay.
right? They just blather and blither. They
Hmm.
splatter all over the place. They don't know what they're doing because they're just trying to see whatever it was. Where's the central node? Where's the center of gravity of fandom right now?
Hmm. Just
Let's go
find a
do that.
compromise between all of those things,
Right. which
essentially.
which is what the fans are trying to do anyway online. But what you
Right.
have are people who are popping up and making themselves important.
Sort of coming back to one of the concepts that I mentioned before, what I'm like, what you have essentially is this continuity that is decided by like a mob, like
Right.
an angry mob. I don't know if angry is the right word, but it's a mass group of people. And what ends up happening, if I'm understanding correctly, is a mess. It's
Mhm.
just it's discontinuous. It
Well,
doesn't
and
really.
also you're cursed as the creator. You're cursed if you give
Okay.
them what they said they wanted, then they win, right? Or
Mm,
in their world, they become contemptuous because they wanted to be surprised.
right. Okay. So, but
And
in
so if
tabletop,
you give them
mm,
not what if you give them something different from what they want, then they argue and scream and write their fanfic.
right.
So you can't win. There's no win. There's no reasoning with fandom. You can't give them
Hmm.
what they want.
I see. Because tabletop role playing games, this idea of contribution, like what you've been talking about, it's infused in the very experience of it, both at the kind of the table level, but also at the more macro level when people
Not
are
quite. The macro level of practitioners is not the same thing as a macro level of purchasing audience.
okay.
We really need to
Practitioners
distinguish.
in
Right.
this case, who are you referring to when you say
Anybody
practitioners?
who actually sits at the table and plays and enjoys themselves doing that medium with
Okay.
whatever system actually facilitates that, and not a
Hmm.
fake system where you roll dice and doesn't mean a damn thing, or you
Hmm.
go blah 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 and say you're storytelling, and it literally means you're fucking storytelling and not doing the thing,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So if you're actually at the tables doing the thing in a huge wide variety of ways and topics, then you're a
Hmm.
practitioner and you're as good as anyone else. There is no celebrity practitioner. Those
So
guys on Critical Role and stuff like that, that's
hmm.
cosplay. They're not role
Hmm.
playing. They're cosplaying role playing.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
actors playing role players. It's
Hmm.
porn. Think about it.
Hmm.
It relates to sex. It relates to role playing as porn relates to sex. Real
Hmm.
people.
I see.
I mean, that has nothing to do with it. That to
So
me,
these
that's
practitioners, they are the ones that are engaged in deciding essentially what is the continuity of this
mhm,
medium.
right. And
Do you feel
go
that
ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
dungeon? Do you just really quick? Do you feel that like game masters or whatever you want to call it have a bit of a privileged position when it comes to this?
That privileged position came out of, I think, of several different influences. And one of them was the fact that in a confused state in the early days, authoritative approaches at the table might have been felt necessary by people just to be able to play at all. If you're
Okay.
dealing, especially after that subcultural falling apart that I talked about,
Hmm.
then you're basically dealing with a bunch of unruly 14-year-olds.
Right.
What are you going to do? You're going to have to say,
Hmm.
hey, look, I'm in charge here.
Hmm.
That's one thing. Another is that the culture of alarms and excursions really, really loved the idea of the celebrity role playing and fantasy author. And
Hmm.
that's been a huge thing. You can shift it over to film directors, you can shift it over to comics creators. Nobody believes in the auteur theory more than a science fiction fantasy pop culture geek. They love the auteur theory. And they want it. They want to be the auteur and they want everyone to kiss their ass. They want to be Joss Whedon badly.
Yeah.
So therefore, being if you can't get it, well, you can be Joss Whedon at your table. Thank you very much.
Hmm.
And in the context that we're talking about, from the 80s into the 90s, especially, and moving up into the 2000s, like I was told, coming up with my copy of Sorcerer, I was told, remember, You're not selling to players, people who play. You're selling to people who buy books.
Mm.
You're selling to people who buy books and fantasize about play and being in charge. That's your customer. And I'm looking at this person in the eye and I'm thinking, boy, are you an asshole?
Mm.
Right. So, little did they know that they had, an old school 70s anarchist,
Mm-hmm.
raised, in the midst of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And would therefore turn around and say, by the way, I have this thing called the internet. I'm going to go do it this way.
Right.
So me aside, the critical point is that if we look at this broader picture of role playing having been sequestered into a fairly narrow corner and hierarchically lower than comic book readers, if we go by the hierarchy of the 80s,
Sure.
role players were not considered much better than furs. In fact, probably maybe worse in some cases. They were considered, they were low on the scale of pop culture status. And the sort of struggle to change that is very important to a number of people, but to me, I don't care, because it doesn't have anything to do with play. It simply has to do with status at a convention. And that doesn't interest me at all.
Right.
So therefore, if we talk about play as such and the medium and its practitioners, you have to stay underground. You have to just go and say, who are these people who are playing? And Ryan did this in the 90s and was shocked to discover how many people were out there actively playing. That's why they went and did this. If he had not got those results, they would never have done it. But he said, oh my God, there's millions of people out there doing this. Who knew?
And in a sense, that's the most valuable part of the whole thing, is this unending kind of creativity that comes from the people.
New people come in. When they encounter the medium itself, they are fascinated and they want to do it. If they then encounter somebody telling them how it's actually going to go, regardless of what they do at the table, they recognize bullshit when they see it and they walk.
Right.
Or if they encounter too much commercial input, you have to buy this and buy this and buy this. After the first year, you buy your first set of 5th edition D&D gear. Well, what parent is going to do that the second year in a row?
Right. Yeah.
When they tell you, oh, you have to buy this now. They're going to say, wait a minute.
Right.
And so
how then? What do you do then as a company, as a firm?
Well, that's the thing.
Or not even as a firm, as a creator, to say, I want people, I know that this creativity is valuable. How do I make sure that they use that to further my system, my game?
1 second. Here is the issue, and it is a critical one that is a little bit of what I told Newt and other people who've interviewed me along these lines. I'm probably the worst person in the world to talk to about this.
Okay.
Because I don't give a shit about furthering the company.
Yes.
And this is important because I am concerned a bit, because it does need to bring in some income. And I've decided that publishing games game text is not the way to do it. I have them. They are available for purchase, and I even print out fairly cheaply made pamphlet versions of them to sell in person for people who want them. But I do not put them into distribution. And I do not consider that an ROI component.
Okay.
So therefore, that's not income. I decided a little while ago that income for me has to be based on value added for people's experience and their learning about it. So therefore, I will accept payment for doing workshops at schools. I accept payment for game design consulting. I accept payment at my Patreon, because if you like what I'm doing, you can support it. And I also in the last 2 years had a lot of success. Sweden was well built, set up for this, um, for actually getting a more programmatic relationship to schools and community centers that
Hmm.
could, like libraries and stuff, and being paid for it.
Right.
Now, my timing on this was very poor because the austerity freaks have finally taken over in the state where I live in Sweden, and they're slicing culture programming really badly.
Mm.
So there I was starting to get hired and really watching my income ramp up with things that I thought were worthy of being paid for.
Hmm. Right.
And then that bottomed. So I'm trying to regroup a little bit, but the philosophy remains the same.
Hmm.
The only way to promulgate play is through play. The only way to uh, the only way to share your design work is to recognize, the only functional way to do it is to recognize that this is your problem, not
Mm.
theirs. The activity does not need your game.
Right.
The activity does not need any game.
So I want to be clear with you that I'm not necessarily asking you that question as a game designer. I'm more asking as an anarchist
Oh
because
yeah,
this process is happening. Like D&D Wizards of the Coast has been extremely successful at making people feel like
right.
D&D is the system. It
I
is
know.
synonymous with tabletop role-playing games. And so
I,
for me, I feel it's important to understand how we got to this place. What are the pillars that are propping this up?
right,
And potentially how we can knock them down.
right. Well, I already knocked down the old ones. I am the guy. The ones in 1990, the late 1990s, when I wrote the essay called "The Nuked Apple Cart," and I said, don't go to the game stores. The game stores are ass. They're horrible. You will
Hmm.
not do well. They're not interested in role playing, and they will not actually promote your game. And besides, the shelf space winners. Remember how I said TSR was trying to control things through shelf space in the late
Mm.
80s? They were steamrolled by the Europeans who knew much better what they were doing with this.
Mm.
And so FASA in particular and a
Hmm.
couple of others just basically steamrolled it. And the
Okay.
Warhammer crowd, just they
Mm.
basically ruined. They were like, "Oh, what? You're trying to do that? No,
Hmm.
we do this." Bam, right, and stomped TSR into the ground through
Right.
shelf space distribution, shelf space capture, and distributor, subordinate, basically.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
anyway, so that had happened, and in the earlier days of the internet, before there were all these platforms and before there were standardized ways of doing anything, we end up with a much more open environment in which play can actually blossom and be
Hmm.
acknowledged for what it is.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Terrible things have happened. The last decade and a half has been absolutely wretched. For one thing, crowdfunding as an idea is great, but the way it was implemented destroyed all the greatness. We effectively now, crowdfunding just means pre-ordering, and
Hmm.
it has returned deadlines, it has returned hype, it has returned production value as the top priorities. So it's absolutely horrific. Um,
Hmm.
so crowdfunding is a wretched and despicable thing at this time. When I worked with Hero Games to do my version of Champions, in the very late 20 teens, so about 5 years ago, um, when I did that, we ran a Kickstarter and I begged them not to. They said, no, that's our business model. This is what we do. And I was thinking, oh God, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be dreadful. Sure enough, what got published was not yet ready and in
Mm.
bad production.
Right.
And I'm very, very unhappy with Champions now as a
Hmm.
published, as a game that I have continued to work on. I love it.
Unfortunately, not an uncommon
Yeah. No, it's
outcome.
typical. I knew it was coming. I knew
Right.
it was coming. I know all about it. I've been, working with Kickstarter people for a long time. In
Mm.
consulting, they say, "Hey, we're going to start our Kickstarter," and I said, "Then I'm out. I'm not here to help you publish and hype a game.
Hmm.
I'm here
Hmm.
for you to work on a game through play, to make fun play, to help fun play be good.
Okay.
That's what I can do. I
Hmm.
cannot help you publish and market your game. If you make that your priority, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you fund."
Hmm. Hmm.
So all of that is that's just, well, that's one thing. The other is the nature of social media, blah blah blah. It's a cliche by now what all the problems with social media are, and I don't need to go into it. But if you put role players, comics fans, anime fans into one basket in social media, I didn't used to think that Dunning's Kruger was an actual thing. I just
Mm.
thought it was a mean thing to say about people a long time ago. Then in the last decade, I've come to realize that maybe it kind of is a thing.
Mm.
And when it comes to those groups of people getting together, it's like Dunnings and Kruger got together and had a baby and it's ugly, right? I
Oh
mean, it's that
God.
bad.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So the absolute enthronement of ignorance and
Hmm.
bullying to promote your brand in that context is beyond belief. Just I would
Mm.
never have imagined it could reach this level. So anyway, my interest is in the activity of role playing. I'll send you a diagram for this.
Okay.
Should not be considered a subset of the subculture of gaming. And it is true that if you are an active role player and you're interested in meeting more people, because you don't have to, by the way, you can just play with people you play with and have people drift in and out of that, through the vagaries of life. You could do that. But
Hmm.
if you are interested in outreach of any kind, system based or otherwise, then you do have to deal with the gaming subculture because that's where people go. But it is a horribly bad idea to look only there
Mm.
and to remember that for 50 years, people naive to the activity have shown up saying, hey, what's this? In
Mm.
large, large, large numbers,
Hmm. Hmm.
and turn walking away in almost as large numbers.
Mm.
So why are we not concentrating there? And then, but the trouble is everybody who's tried to do it has tried to capture them or bring them into the gaming subculture and
Mm.
its particular narrow tropes and its particular codified notions of how you do things. Instead, without introducing them to the medium and celebrating its diversity, so that
Hmm.
they can themselves choose or develop the means of play that they would prefer and be able, and remember, medium as a source of expression. That's what all of these toxic effects have always been dedicated, for whatever reason, to stomping on expression. Fandom, the recapitulation of tropes, genre is not about expression. It's
Mm.
about connoisseurship and competition for fan status.
Okay. Right.
That's very, very different. Whereas
So.
if you encounter a medium and you become aware and enjoy with others your expression within it,
Mm.
that's what they're looking for. When they go past that curtain and say, hey, what are you guys doing in here? That's what they want.
Hmm. Hmm.
And to actually have somebody encounter that and do it is remarkable. Why do you think all the best role players at a table are the newcomers or the so-called casual gamers, the ones who are just there because their partner is there, when they're always the
Hmm.
best?
Mm.
And so the point is we should be learning from them, not the other way around.
In a sense, they haven't been indoctrinated yet.
Not in a sense at all. Literally, they haven't been
Literally,
indoctrinated.
they haven't been
And the
indoctrinated.
ones
Okay.
who are indoctrinated are the people who will put up with abuse or shutdown of their expression to do it because they want to be included or because they feel they can't be otherwise included into anything or whatever. Or because they recognize that they can get status in this if they become blowhards or they spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so those are the people who stay. Now, the problem here is that the how am I going to put it? Is that there is a commercial benefit to doing that. There is a commercial benefit to pumping yourself up as a celebrity in that gaming context, particularly with the internet making doing such things possible.
Yeah.
G plus, while it existed, was an absolute festering sinkhole of such activity.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so it becomes very important from my point of view to say that this is my chosen medium of expression. I'm going to do it. And although I don't have to, I am
Mm,
compelled to work on the instrumentation of it for my own sanity. And then finally, I would like to share it with anybody who wants to, which is a minority of people involved in the gaming subculture, some of whom are in a somewhat traumatized state.
hmm
Um, and to anybody and everybody else through whatever social membranes exist that make that possible.
hmm
And
hmm
it is unconstructed. So
Huh.
basically, one looks around themselves and says, where am I? Whom do I deal with? And who might be involved in role playing or might be interested? And it might not even be the people you think.
hmm
So
hmm
effectively, it's being out and proud.